Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Tax Defense Group. 1-800-BEAT-IRS, beatirs.com. That's B-E-A-T, IRS. They're fighting the modern-day Gestapo. That's their modus operandi. If you have any tax issues, make sure you give them a call. Go to their website. We have with us Chris Jacobs, former policy director for American Next, former senior policy analyst at Heritage, now a senior editor at Conservative Review. He's going to talk to us a little bit about Paul Ryan. Mr. Jacobs, welcome to the Joe Miller Show.
Hi, Joe. It's great to be with you.
Well, I appreciate you coming on to talk to us about this quickly developing story on the speaker. Of course, Ryan was raised as a possible successor to Boehner, so he's kind of the press and political factions have been focused on him. Today we got news that Republican leadership is talking with the Democrats potentially about circumventing the House caucus, the Freedom Caucus. Let's first talk about Paul Ryan, because he's kind of has been put up at least by a trial balloon as a possible successor. I think the conservative wing of the party's kind of shot him down. But you raised another concern that's kind of escaped kind of the mainstream conservative criticism of him as being this kind of establishment guy, and that has to do with a health care plan that apparently he was working on with Senator Marco Rubio. Tell our audience a little bit about that and why there's some concern there.
Sure. Marco Rubio had made some comments around this time last year, and there's been all sorts of rumor mill going around among healthcare wonks, particularly in Washington, D.C., that Marco Rubio and Paul Ryan were working on this healthcare plan, which is an alternative to Obamacare. They haven't put anything out yet, and in some respects we don't know what we don't know because we haven't seen anything about it. And my point in the piece at Conservative Review was it's been over almost a year since Marco Rubio said, well, we're putting out a plan, it'll be out there soon. It's been 18 months since the rumor mill first started around Capitol Hill. What's going on and why haven't we seen anything?
Well, do you think it's because they're now comfortable with Obamacare or just think it's impossible to change?
I don't know. I sure hope not. I don't know if it's a very practical matter of trying to get the numbers to add up. I'm not sure if Paul Ryan doesn't want to work with Marco Rubio because he's running for president and he doesn't want to be seen as taking horses in the presidential primary. I'm not exactly sure, but it strikes me as very interesting that a major presidential candidate said he was going to release a health care plan now nearly a year ago with somebody that's trying to get anointed Speaker of the House or might get anointed by a Republican conference as Speaker of the House, and we haven't seen anything.
Yeah, of course, clear back 2009-2010 when this darn thing passed, you had Republicans poo-pooing the idea of repeal even then, that, it's passed, you aren't getting rid of it. It's the new government plan that you can scream about it as much as you want, but practically speaking, it's going nowhere. The big debate in Alaska about what Murkowski said, for example, regarding repeal and whether or not she's ever wanted to change. Of course, she's on the left side of the aisle there, but, I mean, there are lots of other kind of more mainstream Republicans that have seemingly taken the same tack that, look, we got to live with it. It's there. There's nothing we can do about it. I mean, I kind of suspect that may be what's going on, too.
Well, I think there is some of that within some veins of the party. I thought it was very interesting. Ramesh Ponnuru had a column last week talking about Jeb Bush's health care alternative, Obamacare alternative, and he said, well, Republicans have put out an alternative that we're going to cover as many people as Obamacare without a mandate, and it'll cost less, and we'll get better coverage. Now, if you believe all that's going to happen from the federal government, I've got a bridge nowhere to tell you.
What's your ultimate, and this is kind of going a little bit far afield, but, one of the arguments that the hardcore Republicans have made is, look, Obamacare was never designed to succeed. It was always designed to bring us to a single-payer system. And, of course, there have been major catastrophes in the wake of Obamacare. Do you really think that that's what's behind it?
I think it's what's very interesting in the underreported story is how people aren't buying this stuff. Obama and the Obama administration are trying to sell it, and the American people don't want it. Most people are the only people getting coverage from Obamacare are primarily those people getting it free under the Medicaid expansion, or those just above those getting heavily subsidized by the federal government. It's amazing to me. We had 12 million people last year apply for exemption from the individual mandate. Compare that to only 6 or 7 million people enrolled in the exchanges. American people are every day, this is like a constant election, passing judgment on this law. They don't want it because they aren't buying it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the numbers are what are really curious to me, because you've got, maybe I've seen anywhere from 10 to 20 million people that you could, I guess, argue rationally have gained some benefit from this thing. But then you've got tens of millions of folk that are getting kind of some secondary impacts of this whole thing with, increased deductibles. I mean, the loss of their Cadillac plans. We had a guy that's been on this program whose brother-in-law worked for PepsiCo, lost his Cadillac plan, now has, I think he's got to pay $8,000 or so before he even hits his 80-20 split. And then, of course, the amount he's paying per month has just exploded. And it's basically put him back, $10,000 or $20,000 on a $50,000 a year salary, which, when you talk about the folk that have been impacted in that way across the country, you would think that they'd be almost willing to, do anything to change it. I mean, become political activists on that issue alone. And yet I don't see a lot of that. Even though people have been adversely impacted, I don't see it really impacting the political dialogue much. Do you have an explanation for that?
That's very interesting. And I was shocked that last week in the Democratic debate, healthcare really didn't come up. You saw it twice, not once, but twice, Hillary Clinton ducked the question about did she support single-payer health care, which I think was very interesting. But other than that, health care, Obamacare, our entitlements have not come up in either the Republican or the Democratic presidential debates. I think that's unfortunate because, frankly, we were going broke and our entitlement system was failed even before Obamacare, and it's something that the American people need to face, and we as a country need to face, or otherwise we're going to end up as Greece in the not-too-distant future.
It's interesting that there have been, there's slowing increased cost of health care. And I haven't seen much that really analyzes that, but my guess is that's largely a consequence of the increased numbers of folk that are paying more out of pocket. So it's kind of this reverse impact. How Republicans wanted to introduce, the market into healthcare, get rid of, the intermediary, the third-party payer, so you actually have a cost-benefit analysis going on, and that, of course, would have the market impacts of reducing costs. Now, we've gotten there, but it's because of people now paying these $8,000 and $10,000 and $15,000 deductibles, and they aren't just going to the doctor whenever they need to, or they're actually making an assessment as to lower costs. So in a kind of a twisted way, there is, I guess, some positives in the healthcare area. But, I mean, the ultimate end of all of this is very, very bad. I mean, I just don't see any silver lining to any of it. Do you?
No, I think it's the silver lining is that people aren't buying what the Obama administration is selling, but we still need to do the real tough work of getting rid of some of these regulations, reforming things, and some of that can be done at the federal level, but it also has to go to the states, and it has to allow, as you pointed out, a marketplace to develop and a marketplace to work rather than trying to regulate everything. Hillary Clinton's answer is, well, people are paying too much. Let's regulate drug prices, and let's throw more taxpayer money at the problem, and that'll fix it.
Not going to work. Got to go to break. Chris, we're going to try to keep you on another segment to talk about the House leadership fight. Stay with us. The Joe Miller Show. Be right back. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We have with us Chris Jacobs. He was former policy director for American Next, a senior policy analyst at Heritage, and a policy advisor on Capitol Hill for 5 years. Now senior editor at Conservative Review, wrote a column on Paul Ryan issue relating to health care and a plan that supposedly he and Senator Marco Rubio were creating, but we haven't heard hide nor hair on it. Of course, been in the news because of the leadership fight. I've asked Chris to stay on to talk a little bit about what's going on in the House. Chris, a recent report came out yesterday or today concerning the leadership of the House actually, I guess, going and talking to the Democrats because apparently they're afraid the Freedom Caucus is going to shoot down any establishment candidate that they put forward for leadership. Do you have any inside information on what's going on regarding those discussions?
Well, it is certainly concerning, and in fact, we saw just a few minutes ago a report coming out that there are that Speaker Boehner's chief of staff has talked about that reauthorizing Ex-Im Bank is one of the Speaker's top priorities for the month or the next few weeks before he leaves office. Certainly, that's concerning. And any time that we see movement on priorities that are certainly not conservative and just relying on a lump of Republican and primarily Democratic votes to pass legislation.
Who's out there right now in the running, at least from what you can tell? I mean, Paul Ryan's one of them. Daniel Webster's been put up by the Freedom Caucus. Have any other names been thrown about?
I think at this point, particularly if Congressman Ryan doesn't run, it'd be easier to come up with a list of members of Congress who aren't running for Speaker than those who are. I've seen certainly Congressman Ryan and Congressman Webster. I've heard talk about Marsha Blackburn, Lynn Westmoreland, Bill Flores from Texas, John Klein from Minnesota, who's retiring, and Peter Roskam from Illinois, and on down the list. There will be no shortage of other candidates to jump in the race if Congressman Ryan either decides not to run or cannot obtain the necessary votes.
What's your take on Louis Gohmert? He ran last time. I mean, nobody really knew what he was doing with he was part of the 25 that voted against the Speaker, apparently, last run. He's not part, I just found this out a couple of days ago, apparently not part of the Freedom Caucus, but obviously standing up on the right side of almost all issues. Have you heard anything about what he's doing with respect to the leadership fight?
I have not, to be honest. My initial impression is that Louis Gohmert has a reputation for shooting from the lip, and that endears him to some members and some conservatives. And then there are times when it doesn't endear him to some conservatives, particularly given Congressman McCarthy's comments a couple of weeks ago about the Benghazi Committee, which were an own goal and an early Christmas present to Hillary Clinton. That
right.
may be something that people would be concerned about. But as you say, Congressman Gohmert has been very, very strong and outspoken on a lot of the issues important to conservatives.
Yeah, I find it kind of humorous, your comment, who's not running. Even our own Don Young up here in Alaska made some sort of comment that he'd be a good leader. He'd probably get about one vote his own. But it is pretty amazing, though, to see how this House is in disarray right now. What's your prediction? Do you think Boehner's going to be on for the next few months, or do you think that there's going to be some reaching across the aisle to make the establishment pick stick?
It remains to be seen at this point. I think if the members get back here this evening to Washington, there'll be some conversations in the next day or two. At that point, we'll probably find out whether or not Congressman Ryan is running, and that will then set in the train what ends up happening in terms of a process and a timetable. We still don't have a timetable for when this Speaker election is going to happen in terms of within the Republican conference, let alone the full House of Representatives. You remember that there was some angst amongst a lot of conservatives that when Kevin McCarthy decided to drop out of the race prior to the vote within the Republican conference, at that point, Speaker Boehner just decided to adjourn the meeting. And the idea that he postponed the election basically of his own fiat. So we're not exactly sure how this process is going to work, let alone who all the players are going to be at this point.
Now, Boehner's statement that he was resigning, did that extend even to his own seat? Is he planning on retiring from Congress? What's the extent of his decision as far as at least his involvement with Congress goes? Do you know?
My understanding is that he was going to resign from Congress as well as from the speakership. There aren't too many examples I off the top of my head. Certainly, Denny Hastert resigned his congressional seat, as did Newt Gingrich with the speakership. He certainly could stay on as a member of Congress for, I think, Ohio's 8th district, but I'm pretty sure that he has said that when he resigns as Speaker, he will resign as a member of Congress as well.
Now, I'm going to challenge your historical knowledge here a little bit. Has there ever been a time where the Congress has actually picked a speaker from outside of its membership?
Not off the top of my head, but it is certainly not a requirement for the speaker to be a member of Congress.
And of course, you've heard floating is, not this isn't a trial balloon, obviously, but some Newt Gingrich supporters have floated his name as being a possibility. I don't think anybody is seriously considering that, but it makes for kind of interesting political dialogue, though, the idea that, we might not be just talking about the 200 plus members of the majority in Congress, but you could actually have some potential candidates from outside of that. I wanted to talk just briefly, we've just got 2 or 3 minutes left here on this segment, about the Freedom Caucus. Now, obviously, what's happened with McCarthy, they've flexed their muscle, and they've actually had real impact, I believe. Do you think that's emboldening them for future fights?
Well, I think so, and I think based on everything I've seen and heard coming from the Freedom Caucus, for them, it's about the process as much as the policy, and trying to force changes that in House rules and in Republican conference rules that the speaker, whoever he or she is, cannot attempt to dictate an outcome by ramming and jamming legislation through the body. And we saw that certainly with Nancy Pelosi and Obamacare and cap and trade in 2009 and 2010. And I think there really has been, as somebody who's worked on Capitol Hill, all the power seems within the leadership as opposed to the committee structure or the rank and file members. So I think they're trying to empower the rank and file members to have more of an impact, and are really want to make those changes regardless of who the speaker is, whether it's Paul Ryan or John Boehner or somebody else, or Nancy Pelosi for that matter.
Now, I know that, obviously, if you're a member of the Freedom Caucus, it requires backbone because you're bucking the establishment on so many fronts. So they all are leaders. But just pick the handful of those in the caucus that are really, if there is any dictation, there's not much. But if there's anybody that's really managing the messaging of the Freedom Caucus, who is it in the caucus that's doing that?
Well, I think it's primarily run out of and through Jim Jordan's office, congressman also from Ohio. Who was a former chairman of the Republican Study Committee, very much a fiscal conservative, and really tries to organize this, certainly through the fight on defunding Planned Parenthood going into August and September. Saw that in similarly on the leadership fight once Speaker Boehner decided he was going to step down.
Former wrestler, I believe. He knows how to scrap, and I think the leadership has its work cut out if it's ever going to try to circumvent that. Hopefully they won't. Hopefully in the budget fights, the caucus stands up and does what it needs to do to push back against the growth of government. Chris Jacobs, thanks for being with us. Appreciate your insights on this.
Thanks for having me.
Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show, right back after these messages.